So here is a very interesting machine that is also an interesting part of computer history. The HP Integrity rx2620, which is a server in the HP Integrity line. Now this is notable because of the processor the HP Integrity line uses, which is the Intel Itanium 2 processor. Now the Intel Itanium processor has a very interesting history. Basically, HP wanted to replace their PA RISC line of processors with a new design that was based on very long instruction word technology. They had Intel work with them and market the processor as a general purpose processor, and they tried to get all these other companies on board. Compaq got on board and was porting OpenVMS to it when they got bought by HP, while Silicon Graphics also got on board and released some generic Linux systems with the Intel Itanium processor. What also happened was IBM and Dell made their own Itanium systems, and some other companies did as well. Of course, Itanium ended up being one of the great tech flops of the 2000s, and it was only really used in HP hardware, because HP used it to replace the PA RISC and Alpha lines of hardware. They replaced them with the Intel Itanium 2, which was arguably worse in many ways, but it also gave more performance than those two simply because the Itanium line of processors was still in development while those other two lines were on life support and not really updated until they could port both OSs, OpenVMS and HPUX, to the Integrity systems. Now this system has two 1.6 GHz Intel Itanium 2 processors. They weren't the first generation ones because the first generation ones were only really used in some Intel reference machines that were rebranded by other companies like the HP i2000, for example. And I know Silicon Graphics made one as well that was on that same hardware. But this is an HP Integrity, and it has HP's own ZX1 chipset, which could also work with later PA RISC processors as well. And on some systems you could flash the system and then switch out CPUs to get an Itanium system while keeping the same chassis, motherboard, hard drives, everything. And you'd also need to reinstall the OS too, but that's another story. Now, on the front of the system, you can see this has a very distinct look for an HP server. And this actually shares the same case as some of the later HP 9000s. There are three hard drive bays, and I think these hard drive caddies are, for the most part, proprietary to the Integrity line, though I think a ProLiant server uses these hard drive caddies as well. There's the Find button, where you can push it and it will blink a light letting you know where the system is in the rack. There's four lights that tell you the diagnostic state of the system, and all Itanium systems have this, or they'll do it through a management card. This is an older one, so it's got the lights, but it also has a management card in here, but despite that, it uses the lights when you turn on the system, which blink in a pattern from 1, 2, 3, and 4 left until what happens is it finds an error. And if it doesn't, they go out. But if it finds an error, it will make a beep sound or will light up the patterns and the fans will rev up if it's a fan problem. There's the LAN light, so you can know if the system's connected to Ethernet. The system status light, which lets you know if the system has errors logged in it or an error right now. And the power light, which is next to it, which blinks when it's in off mode and is lit when it's on and is not on at all if the system's unplugged. And right here there's a DVD RW drive, which is unusual for a server, but I'm guessing that's what they had when this was made. Now, there's also a card that slides out here that has a serial number, and I think this is interesting because there's actually something on there you don't see much on Itanium systems, which is a Windows Server 2003 COA. Now, usually these Itanium systems were sold with HPUX or OpenVMS, and in some cases Linux. So usually you don't see a Windows Server COA on these machines, but this machine has one. It's a real Microsoft COA for Itanium. And it actually says 64 in there. And of course on the other side of that's the serial number and everything, and the model number, which says it's an HP Integrity rx2620, as I'll show you. Let me just hold up. Yeah. This right here, HP Integrity rx2620. So, right now I'm going to look at the back of the system, and then I'll give the system power, plug it in, and boot Windows for Itanium. Because here's one interesting part about Itanium. You know, like how I said that that they wanted this to be a general purpose CPU? Well, Intel's master plan for Itanium was that this would trickle down and replace x86. So Windows was ported along with Linux, and that is what runs on this machine. Windows, Linux, OpenVMS, or HPUX. So right now, you can see the back of the system. There is a SCSI port here, which says it has automatic SCSI termination. The management card, which has LAN, VGA, and a 3-way serial port. If you plug one device in, though, you'll get the serial console. There's 2 gigabit LAN ports on the motherboard, another light button that lets you identify the system, the TOC button, which is the reset button, and HP 9000s have these as well. From what I can tell, it dumps the OS in HPUX and resets it. There's the keyboard and mouse USB ports. These are special, and you have to connect a plain USB keyboard and mouse to this, or you'll get some error messages, which are very cryptic and make a beeping noise. And I had this happen to me before when I tried plugging a wireless mouse in. There's 2 generic USB ports, 2 serial ports, one's for console, one's serial B. However, because there's a management card in here, I don't know if it will use that as the console, because I tried getting another one of these up and working for someone the other day, and well, it wasn't displaying any video other than a blinking cursor, and the console A port wasn't working, so I think it was set up to use the management card's processor. And of course, there are 2 additional Ethernet ports added onto the system here. There's also a key, a lock, and a lever you can pull to get to the system. And I don't feel like opening up the system now, especially since if you open up the system, from what I can tell, it activates a switch which lets the system know the cover's open, and probably revs up the fans and might cause some issues until the system's reset, because I know Macs are that way. Anyways, I'm going to plug the system in, give it some power, and boot up Windows Server 2003 for Itanium. So this right here is the front panel of the rx2620 after system power has been applied. There are 2 lights flashing right now. The system light, which is flashing because there's probably an error logged in the management controller, and the power light, which is flashing because it's off. If you push this button, which is the identification button, while power is applied, it will also flash to let you know which server you are working on. And you can activate this remotely with the management controller, from what I can tell. And nearly every server lets you do this. With the management controller, that is. And the server is plugged in, like I said. And the system, when I turn it on, you'll notice 2 things. One of which is the self-test lights flashing from this way, left to right. And of course, you'll also notice when I turn on the system that the system also has some noisy jet engine cooling fans. Now, unlike the HP, unlike the ZX6000, which has much quieter fans, this has much noisier fans, and therefore it runs at a lower temperature because it's spinning the fans a lot faster, instead of slowly like the HP ZX6000 does. and you will hear this Itanium jet engine cooling that is needed to keep the system cool. So I just push the big, nice round power button, and the system is now booting, flashing lights from 1 to 4 in this pattern. And here's the thing, if there's an error, they will light up in a certain pattern, kind of like Dell's diagnostic lights do, if you've ever had a Dell desktop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the monitor, which is currently inactive, as it's still doing those flash lights, and it still kind of is because it's in the BIOS, but now you're getting messages on the screen about boot time events, launching, and starting EFI, which is the predecessor to UEFI, which most modern computers now have if they're x86 based. I mean, if you go into like a Walmart or a Sam's and you buy a laptop, it definitely has UEFI, and the same with any new motherboard, unless of course you use CSM mode, which emulates BIOS. This machine does not have CSM mode, however, because it is an Itanium system. So let's check out the BIOS. There are a bunch of boot menu options which are written into the BIOS and not the hard drive, so even if you pull out the hard drive, you'll still see HPUX or Windows Server 2003 Enterprise. Let's go to boot configuration. You can edit the boot order, reset the system, change driver settings, and display what drivers are in the system. Console configuration, select input and output console and the air console. This is so you can boot the system over serial, and some OSs like OpenVMS require you to do this. You can go to system configuration, change the time and date, set the system defaults, check out advanced system information like the serial number, the CPUs, the RAM, the hard disk, the CD-ROM drive, all this stuff. Like which CPU is the Monarch CPU or not. LAN addresses, firmware revision, chip revision. So yeah, these are two 1.6 gigahertz Itaniums. I think they are the original one because they only have one core and don't feature virtualization. There's security configuration too. But and there's also the EFI shell, which is kind of like the UEFI shell on computers that support it. So, let's exit this. Now let's boot Windows Server 2003 for Itanium. Now, here's the interesting part. Microsoft ported Windows to Itanium, kind of like they did with the DEC Alpha and MIPS and PowerPC for those systems. Now, as you can see, it says starting Windows, and right now it is at this starting Windows screen, kind of like Windows 2000 does. But it sits there a lot longer, kind of like when you're booting it from a CD or booting one of those like BART PE CDs, like that Ultimate Boot CD for Windows. So it sits here at this starting Windows screen for a while. And it does this for quite some time for some reason. I don't know why it does this, but then eventually, after sitting at the start Windows screen for a while, it then transitions to the Windows Server 2003 boot screen that you're all too familiar with, that looks just like XP's. If you have XP installed, it'll boot that, but the thing is, if you have an Itanium system, always use Server 2003 because it got more updates compared to XP for Itanium, which was abruptly dropped in 2005 and does not even have Internet Explorer 7. You're just stuck with Internet Explorer 6. And trust me, nobody wants to be stuck with just Internet Explorer 6. And now you can see the Windows Server 2003 boot screen you all know and love on Itanium. So now I've actually plugged in a USB sound card to the system and some portable iPod speakers, and now you can see that the system, it looks and feels just like Windows because it is Windows. Now, this can run programs compiled for the older Intel processors, which is useful because there are a lot of programs that aren't compiled for the Itanium processor. You'll have to compile a lot of this stuff yourself, but as you can see here, Intel Itanium inside. And of course it also has IE in secure mode, because it's Windows Server. XP doesn't do this, I don't think. So you can see here, server rx2620 HP, Intel Itanium 2 Madison. Doesn't have a whole lot of info about the system here, and it's not a real fast system either. Go to system info. rx2620 IA64 Family 31 Model 2 Stepping 2. This is an Itanium, and Windows is running on Itanium. Now the thing is though, this isn't too fast, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go to Documents and Settings, All Users, Share Documents, File Share. I copied this on through the network. Kega Fusion. Now this is a Sega Genesis emulator for Intel x86. And as you can see, this is very taxing because it's trying to emulate the x86 processor. Originally, there was a emulator for the x86 processor that was on chip, but then they moved it to software, and I think this version of 2003, because it's Service Pack 2, has it in software. So as you can tell, it's hovering at around 30, and then when I load a game, it runs even worse. So let's run Sonic 3 Knuckles. Look at all that frame skipping. Now this is running an emulation right now, so it's basically emulating an emulator. Let's run. Look at this frame rate. It's going down. And this is Itanium trying to run an emulator for Intel x86. Now, Genesis emulators are usually very light. And you can run Genesis emulators well on a Pentium 1. However, at the same time though, this does not run very smoothly at all. And this is because Itanium had very poor x86 emulation and functionality. And that's one of the reasons this processor failed, was because of how horrible the x86 emulation was. But when you're writing code natively for it too, many developers hated this due to how strange and unconventional the CPU was, because the CPU required the compilers to optimize the code for it, because it was designed for compilers to take advantage of the CPU and not say the CPU running the code like normally. And due to its strange architecture, the Itanium system flopped, and once you try using it, it's easy to see why. Now, I might try running other programs or recompiling other programs for this processor on here in the future. Right now, I would probably have to change a lot of things to get stuff to compile on here, simply because of, one, how little there actually is with regards to compilers, and two, the other issue with this is, well, the fact that it's Itanium Windows, and so it's harder to do stuff than it is on Linux when it comes to compiling stuff, and I might end up putting Linux on here and using it as a Linux system instead of a Windows one, considering how it's probably easier to like get code compiled on Linux and whatnot compared to, say, Itanium Windows. But hey, it's Itanium Windows and it has some novelty, as you can see here, but other than that, it's kind of a waste of time. And that's all that needs to be said. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more.